This past weekend, competitors from all over North America got together in one room and played in the largest tournament to date for the Ursa's Return metagame. In this video, we're going to be breaking down the top 64, the top 16, and showcasing some of the best decks in Disney Lorcana from the past weekend. Let's get into it. The Disney Lorcana Challenge Chicago Top 64 looked exactly like this. 25 Ruby Sapphire decks, 15 Emerald Steel, 9 Sapphire Steel, 6 Amethyst Ruby, 3 Amber Ruby, 2 Amber Steel, 2 Amethyst Emerald, 1 Amber Emerald, and 1 Amethyst Steel. Being in the room, honestly, walking through the tournament in the last few rounds, it's really not a shock to me at all as a competitor to see Ruby Sapphire sitting there as the king of the mountain in the top 64. No, it didn't win the tournament, as we're going to break down shortly, but it really was a successful deck within the metagame. It was highly competitive. It really was all over the top tables, and I'm sure that in some cases, this could have went either way. It was a 50-50 split in a lot of games. There were a lot of players in the last round playing for win-and-ins, and I know that some of those players were also playing Ruby Sapphire, so it could have turned the other direction. There might have been 30 or more nearly competing for half of the percentage of what this top 64 could have looked like. 25 is a really strong number, but it crazily really could have been more. The other thing to note here is this low representation of some of the decks on the end. Rogue decks were able to get in. We're going to be looking at both of those decks upcoming soon in the video of the Jafar Amethyst Steel deck, the Amber Emerald Songs deck, and of course, some of the others that even squeaked all the way into the finals, even though there wasn't that much representation within the top 64. Just kind of showcasing that Disney Lorcana challenges really can be won by any deck within the metagame, as long as you're prepared, and definitely more prepared than your opponents when gaining an edge in deck building. Well, with that, let's take a look at some of these decks. Amber Ruby Mufasa. Mufasa is a deck that has gotten many new tools over the last several sets since Mufasa was revealed. In this set, we picked up a lot of new synergies for our Rapunzel and Healing Draw package. Mulan, paired with Mother Gothel, is now not one but two characters that can enable very nice draw packages, along with Julieta Madrigal as another way to make your character a little bit better from the heal and drawing cards to replace oneself. I think the biggest addition to this deck was Gaston. Gaston being a 2/4 uninkable 3-cost character for 1 lore that has the ability of dubious recruitment, which is exert this, you pay 2 less for the next character you play this turn. A Gaston on 3 really enables very powerful play lines on turn 4. Now on turn 4, we can effectively play a 4-cost character for 2 and then play our 2-cost character all the while, which means we can start refilling our hand with Mother Gothel and Rapunzel extraordinarily early in the game. This also means that we can play characters like Medusa, Lady Tremaine, and even Peter Pan, the Pirate's Bane, as well on turn 4. Playing a 6-cost character with 2 lore that has 4 strength and 5 willpower on turn 4 is definitely a nice way to pressure the game. It also controls the game quite well because it manages so many different characters that are being problematic in the current metagame. Peter Pan checks Pegasus, it checks Diablos. Sisu Embodied Warrior is starting to look like the staple of choice in Ruby decks at the 3-cost slot. 3-cost inkable 1/4 2 lore with the ability of Surge of Power. This character gains +1 strength for each card in opponent's hands. This is a card that really, on average, is a 4/4 or a 5/4 out of your 3-cost character, truly dominating any presence early on in metagames. Of course, this deck also is still packaged with all the Ruby removal you expect, having 1 Be Prepared and 1 Scar to keep opponents honest, having the 2 Maleficents along with 3 Mauis, 2 Brawl, 3 Teeth and Ambitions. I do believe that Teeth and Ambitions is honestly not a card that's very good anymore, but specifically in a deck with Julieta and Rapunzel, and even a character like Mufasa, which inevitably is going to go away anyway. Of course, the number 1 stud in this list is Flynn Rider Frenemy. This is a card that I cannot stop talking about. It's definitely Ruby's answer to the Sapphire matchups. It's the one card in here that I wish was a 4 of. I think this card is so dominant in games against Sapphire that not having it on turn 2 feels almost criminal. So if I was going to make any immediate change to this list, I think I would 100% up my tick of Flynn Rider to play 4 because I need to be able to mulligan for it early on in games and truly put this card into play and dominate the game with it. Shout out to Wade here in his top 64 finish, playing a rogue deck within the metagame. I will say that this deck was in our testing room, and it did test very well into the majority of the meta. It's definitely not a deck to go, oh, there was only 1 or 2 of these in the top 64. It's probably not that good. They got lucky. I wouldn't be saying any of those things. I think this deck absolutely has a place within the metagame, and if you give it a chance, you might even have a ton of fun playing it. Amethyst Steel also had a top 64 finish, and this is with none other than Jafar, A Whole New World. Jafar, Striking Illusionist, is a character that since its reveal from Into the Inklands is a card that everyone has been frightened by. The idea that you can gain 7 lore, draw 7 cards, and put your opponent on the back foot to basically any other turn forward, being on a 4/5 evasive character with a shift 5 ability really does create moments that people are certainly afraid of. This deck really didn't get any new cards. If you really look at this list, there are 0 cards from Ursula's Return in the deck list. This is a Into the Inklands full-blown version of Jafar, A Whole New World wheel. I think that speaks volumes when people start talking about, oh, a new set comes out, I need to buy these cards, I need to catch up with the metagame, I need to really be invested. Craig here finished in top 64 of a near 1,000-player tournament and didn't register a single Ursula's Return card. That tells you right there that we need to be looking for diamonds in the rough because we can find these things. These cards exist. These strategies still exist. They're still prevalent. Just because new cards come out doesn't mean that metas evolve and warp immediately or all the time. There really can be things found in the past that can truly dominate any given metagame. So while we have seen this deck before, while it has been successful in previous tournaments, it's really a breath of fresh air to see, oh, hey, I didn't need to go Diablo. I didn't need Sisu. I didn't need any of these bonkers, new, expensive legendary cards. I just took what I had. I knew my matchups. It didn't change the deck. There was nothing really modified that I had to truly flip the script. No, I have a straightforward game plan. My game plan is to threaten with Jafar, be able to draw as many cards as possible, gain additional lore, and really just punish opponents for not respecting my gameplay. There were a lot of decks that said, hey, Along Came Zeus isn't very good in the metagame right now. I'm going to take it out of my deck. Ruby decks have kind of removed cards like Lady Tremaine from a lot of their lists. Maleficents are at an all-time low. I would say that this deck's worst matchup is probably Ruby Sapphire that's playing 3 or 4 of all of these removal cards, but the majority of decks in the metagame did not respect Jafar, and because of that, Craig here found himself in a top 64 slot at the DLC Chicago. Congratulations to you, sir. Phenomenal meta call. Would have been really interesting to see if you could have made a deeper run in the top 64 cut. At DLC Chicago, it might have been one of the first times in Lorcana history that Amber Steel didn't come in and win a major event. However, Zach Bivens was damn well interested in trying to accomplish that feat. Zach here finished in first place overall in Swiss at the end of day 1 and took an unfortunate loss in top 32 of the main event at DLC Chicago. What I can say is that the way the brackets were lining up, it looked like there was a very good chance that our teammate George Goof was going to end up playing against Zach in top 16. So at that point, they're playing for a top 8 spot. They both would have been awarded a Nationals invite, which would have been nice. But George is definitely not looking to settle for a top 16 and lose to a bad matchup. So myself and Dick Burns sat down for almost an hour, a little bit over an hour, and played games into this deck from the Ruby Amethyst standpoint. And what I can say in that hour is I learned how powerful this deck really is. Not only was it probably a 95-5 matchup into Ruby Amethyst, and specifically the Ruby Amethyst that George was playing, because it only had 4 1-drops, which was definitely greedy into matchups like this, but really very good and powerful into matchups like Emerald Steel. This deck overperformed. And I think Zach would tell you himself how powerful this deck really is, explicitly in a world where opponents didn't understand what it was going on, wasn't prepared to play against Amber Steel, because it was a deck that wasn't very heavily talked about going into DLC Chicago. It was actually being brought down because it was said that the blue-red and Ruby Sapphire matchup was awful. That's not the case. I think this deck is probably one of the best decks in Lorcana right now. I think that if you're willing to take the opportunity to play 19 Uninkables and play a deck like this and really sit down and start playing games against your opponent, I think you'll be truly shocked by the power that this deck has. Let's break it down. So first and foremost, very similar to the Jafar list here, there's only one new addition from Ursula's return into that deck, and that is Ursula Vanessa herself. Adding a 2-cost, 1 strength, 4 willpower, 1 lore, singer 4 character to this deck really did wonders. It ended up increasing the synergy and power level as a whole from this particular deck list. Now having Cinderella that can sing all of your 3-cost songs, be followed up by a 2-cost character with 4 willpower that can also sing all your songs, minus, of course, Grab Your Swords and A Whole New World, is fine. The idea that Ursula on 2 can start singing and then Along Came Zeus on 3 is great. Having the ability to also sing Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire is wonderful as well. Maybe later in the game, World's Greatest Criminal Mind being sung by Ursula will also come up. I think that's the core here, is that many people written off this deck list into the Sapphire matchups. But when all the Sapphire decks are relying on a card like Tamatoa to win, and you're an Amber deck that has World's Greatest Criminal Mind in your toolkit, then playing 3 of them really makes a difference in the matchup. Most opponents are not expecting to play their Tamatoa against you and it be banished by 1 card. That's exactly what World's Criminal Mind does. And the craziest thing about it is that you have 21 characters in your deck that can sing the song. So while they're exerting 8 resources to play their Tamatoa, all you have to do is exert one of those 21 or 22 characters, if I can't count, and remove the card from the game and continue on pressuring the game in your manner. I think this is a deck that truly is powerful. It's a deck that has always been around. It's always been successful. And while it is 19 Uninkables and a bit greedy, I think even Zach would tell you that his top 32 matchup, if he maybe had 1 or 2 less Uninkables in the deck, it might have been more secure. He was definitely favored in the matchup. So losing in top 32 to himself and to the deck beating itself is definitely a position that nobody wants to be in a day 2 format. All in all, huge shout out to Zach Bivens. He had a wonderful showing. Finishing first overall in Swiss once again is a remarkable feat. And in all honesty, Zach is probably itching to get out of that top 32 slot that he's been locked into for 2 DLCs now. If he continues to create deck lists like this that are so well designed for the metagame, I'm sure before we know it, he'll be finding his way into a top 8 or better. Amber Emerald Under the Sea. Joseph Quigley took this deck to a top 32 finish at the DLC in Chicago. What I can say for certain about this list is that I told a bunch of people that I was working on Amber Emerald. For me personally, I could not get the deck in a position that I felt comfortable in enough matchups that I wanted to play this deck. However, it was definitely a deck that I was very high on. I think Under the Sea is one of the more playable cards within Lorcana, and it was really threatening some of the more specific matchups that I expected to see going into the DLC Chicago. Having answers to a lot of what Amber Steel does, having answers to almost everything that Emerald Steel does, along with being really good into Hirons. It really did pressure the game so very well because none of those decks interacted that well with what you were doing, or they were forced to take turns off to interact with you to slow you down. Now, in testing, what I had learned personally is that if your opponent knows to just slow down and kind of pick off your pieces one by one, you don't have the best recovery rate. If your opponent decided to play solitaire with their decks, you were able to punish them and kind of pick up wins for almost free. The deck really did feel so very good early on in testing, but as I got into the later stages of testing, when I was kind of deciding, hey, is this deck truly real or not, I personally could not get over the hump and say, yeah, this is a deck that I'm comfortable bringing with me to a DLC. But Joseph here crushed. Top 32 finish with this list is remarkable. Let's break it down. I think what I want to start with by saying is that unlike the last few decks, this deck very much is an Ursula's Return deck list. The Muses and Under the Sea, Diablo, We Don't Talk About Bruno, are all these cards that really make this deck possible. I think many fell into the trap when building this list of being too reliant on a card like Ursula, Deceiver of All. And what I learned very early on in testing is that that card was not as important. Removing her entirely is just not out of the question to me whatsoever. It definitely showed to be successful here. This list was very much a Prince John deck list. While you were very good at filtering and being able to clear the board so very effectively with cards like Under the Sea, We Don't Talk About Bruno, dominating hand presence with 4 Bare Necessities, which I know is a card that, in all honesty, in the past, people are like, there's no way I would ever play 4 Bare Necessities. For me, personally, this list itself and any version of this deck probably should always be playing 4 Bare Necessities. If you're interested in this deck list at all, whatever you do not cut that card. It's too good. The follow-up here is a card that we have probably have all truly forgotten, which is You Have Forgotten Me. A 4-cost inkable that forces opponents to discard 2 cards, along with the compounding effect of Lucifer, the 5-cost uninkable 2/2 with 2 lore that has the ability of when it comes into play, your opponent discards either an action or 2 cards. I think this is just a compounding effect of understanding that, hey, I can control the board really, really well, but if my opponent has enough resources, they can kind of get out of it. And the real pain of this list in general is that it's not very fast. Adding cards, like Prince John, Lucifer, and to an extent, Kita definitely has the ability to turn sideways and let you gain lore a little bit faster. I'm sure a lot of people would look at this list and go, why aren't you playing flutes? And the simple answer is that you were continuously playing Ariel on average a bunch. And every single time you play Ariel, you're likely to hit a flute, and you can't draw the flute with Ariel. It goes to the bottom. My list was also playing cards like Be Our Guest or Look at My Family, which is another way to look at the top, and you can never find the items. So playing the items in the list were just unreliable, which is why, I wish we could play it. I wish there was enough draw power. You can get to the extent where you can play cards like Rapunzel, maybe, and that way you can draw into it more freely. And I do think that some number of them, if you can make it work, are very good in this list because it can help quicken your pace and create another threat that your opponent can't simply answer. The biggest fear here with this list is that it just folds to cards like Brawl. It folds to cards like Sisu. It just doesn't have any respectable answers to those types of cards. So every time you look at that, you're like, man, if I give my opponent the opportunity to draw out, then I'm in trouble because I just don't have a good recovery system. I think this deck is on the edge. I think the more and more that people play this deck, they're going to be successful with it. It just has to find its real piece of the metagame that it's successful against. And I think personally where I would be is that I would start looking at this list and going, okay, what do I concede to? And I think it's okay if I concede to that metagame and concede to that portion of the metagame, as long as I know that I'm successful in all the other matchups leading around it. Congratulations again to Joseph Quigley on a top 32 performance with one of the decks that were definitely on the radar, but no one has really seemingly truly figured out yet. Here's a look at the top 16 decks from DLC Chicago. 20% with coming in at 5 is Ruby Sapphire, 26.7% with 4 Emerald Steel, 33% with 3 Sapphire Steel, 50% 3 Amethyst Ruby, and 50% 1 Amethyst Emerald. The breakdowns are the percentages from decks that were in top 64 that were successful and made it into the top 16. So you can see here the best conversion rates were Amethyst Ruby and Amethyst Emerald. There were only 2 Amethyst Emerald decks in top 64, and one of them ended up in top 16, nonetheless actually ended up in the finals. I think it's important to see what this breakdown looks like for several reasons. Really, that is this. The day 2 format so far is a top 64 single elimination. Now, you can see here that there were several Amber Steel lists that were in, the cut for day 2, but none of them were successful in finding it home in top 64. We can really kind of go through why that is, but it's really just notable that first place does not secure you a guarantee that you're going to make top 16 or top 8 or anything like that. Just because you're going first in day 2 doesn't mean that it's just going to be like the end all be all of success going into the later stages of the tournament, which is at top 16, which gets you that continental invite for what we're saying. But it's also interesting to note that, hey, just because I'm the only one or one of a few in top 64 doesn't mean that my deck can't find a way to win and be successful in this tournament, get me a continental invite, get me a Mickey Mouse gold plated, all of those things. You can see that all of these players here found a way and be successful in that format. So it is just really interesting to note that just because you're playing the best deck in the room doesn't mean you're going to be successful. Just because you have a higher seed doesn't mean you're guaranteed to win. All of those things have to come into notion. And really, as we start exploring what the top 64 really looks like, it's actually something that I'm going to be focused on an entire other video covering the 2-game format and my feelings on it as a whole after playing in 2 tournaments and really being observant of what was actually going on in these tournaments. I think it's something that really needs to be discussed on its own. But all in all, top 16 breakdown, really nice spread, 5 different decks, which is great. And also different versions of these decks as well. It's not like these are all, the same exact looking deck list across the board. They're definitely all unique and individualized to the player and what they were expecting to see within, the DLC Chicago. Let's break down some of these decks, though. Sapphire Steel Wheel, played by Andrew Zhang, finished in the top 16, picking up a continental invite. Now, this is a list that I played as well at DLC Chicago, and the core and honestly one of the only fundamental differences here is that Andrew was playing a whole new world and I wasn't. Aside from that, the list is dramatically close in choices. What I will say is that the differences in this list and why it could be successful is really understanding what our matchups are. And I felt personally, for me, playing Sapphire Steel was that I needed to be able to be successful in the Ruby Sapphire matchups and not get O2'd for a loss. It looks to me that Andrew agreed with this statement. Playing 2 Hades and 1 Let It Go is definitely a way to understand that. Playing 2 Rise of the Titans is also a way of understanding that. Rise of Titans, banishing a location or an item, gives you versatility in matchups. It's also inkable. So having the idea that like, oh, I can get rid of my opponent's lucky dimes when I have to in this matchup, or I can get rid of Queen's Castles in another matchup is just a true tech card, I think, for the metagame. Playing 2 Hades and 1 Let It Go is your best way to answer opposing Tamatoas. Also noting that specifically those cards are good and meant for those specific reasons, I believe is important. It also can answer cards like Hiram as a way for you to kind of break serve in the mirror. I do think a lot of the mirror games come down to who can stick their Hiram and draw the most cards with the Hiram. So I think that that's very important. The more fundamental thing here is playing for Cogsworth. Cogsworth was definitely the bane of existence of every steel mirror this past weekend, committing to 4 of them and showing, hey, I am really committed to that card. I'm committed to winning the board, and definitely in the mirror, having more than 2 or 3 of these and just committing to all 4 really is just showcasing like I'm not going to give up wins to opposing Sapphire Steel decks. So huge congratulations to Andrew here, finding a way into a top 16. He wasn't the most successful Sapphire Steel deck. There was actually one more that finished in top 8, but this list in general was very good. I think it's a starting point for all moving forward. I think if you really just wanted to say, hey, I want to learn how to play Sapphire Steel Wheel, this list really doesn't have any hiccups. I think it's a very good 60 cards, and it's definitely a nice traditional way to learn how to play this deck. What I will say from experience, personally, if you're going to play something like this, you definitely need to take the time and learn mirror matches. I think this is a versatile deck in the game. I think a lot of players are going to feel comfortable playing this list. And because of that, you need to be more comfortable. You need to put yourself in a position to be successful in those matchups, to best understanding the ways to gain specific lore counts. I think that's the hugest thing here for this particular list is understanding that you don't need to win the game early, but you need to get to a certain point in the matchup that allows you to win the game immediately. That is the biggest takeaway that I've learned. Understanding that, hey, I really kind of need to get to 6 or 8 lore if possible. And sometimes it doesn't matter if I make a trade or not, because I know that my hand is set up to gain 14 or 16 lore just with 1 to 2 cards. So really, it's about thinking turns ahead based on your hand. Specifically, if you're after a whole new world in this list, after a whole new world, you should know what your next 3 or 4 turns are going to look like in one turn, in one moment, so you can plan for the best possible outcome. This is definitely a deck that's a lot of fun. It's very powerful. It has lots of good and fair matchups that where you can be slightly favored if you understand the matchup better than your opponent. Congrats again to Andrew. When it comes to Ursula's return, Amethyst Ruby picked up 3 very important cards that I think are almost an auto include in every single Ruby deck moving forward. Flynn Rider Frenemy, Sisu Embodied Whir, and Brawl. Brawl has really just become the best 3-cost removal in Disney Lorcana. You can continuously see decks playing 3 or 4 copies, and for me, the fact that it's inkable, I think it should always be a 4-copy card. It removes so many characters in the game that it's unbelievable. Its combination in Sapphire with the addition of Ice Block also just extends the reach of the card by so much that it's definitely a 4 of in those lists. I think by not playing 4 of this card in any of your Ruby decks moving forward, you're probably cheating yourself from free removal, over the course of a game. The idea that it turns Hiram into only a draw 2 is massive. So many Sapphire decks are relying on drawing 4 cards off Hiram that when you're able to just pay 3 resources to remove Hiram from the game and banish him off the field, you're taking so many more resources away from your opponent, and you're definitely slowing them down a ton. Flynn Rider and Sisu has been the 1-2 punch for this deck to win so many games, but it's frankly one of the most impossible play lines for Ruby Sapphire or most Sapphire decks to deal with at all. In order for them to deal with you, they have to take full turns off early on when their game plan is to play cards like One Jump and Fishbone Quill or How Far I'll Go and ramp the board to have a better mid game. But when you pressure the game so early with these cards so specifically, it forces them to stop and answer. And when they don't stop and answer, you get to gain anywhere between 4 to 8 to 10 to 12 lore. If you're able to gain 8 to 10 lore with just those 2 cards, you just threaten the game so well for the final remaining turns of the game in a world where you have Madam M Snake, Madam M Fox, and Merlin Goat. I think this deck is ironically very well positioned. I will say that there are cards in here that could get changed, could get moved around. I think we'll see the numbers get fixated on. But all in all, Ruby Amethyst definitely is not the most powerful deck in the Disney Lorcana anymore, but it has windows of opportunity that really punishes opponents for not respecting it. The Queen's Castle might still very well be one of the most dangerous cards in the game. I still don't think enough players are respecting it, and I think it's one of those cards that might just steal so many games of Disney Lorcana moving forward within the Ursula's Return metagame. Shout out and congratulations to Alberto once again. Ruby Sapphire finished in 3rd place at the DLC Lorcana Challenge in Chicago. Tomas here was able to find his way into a top 4 with, in all honesty, a pretty stock version of Ruby Sapphire. And I'm not even saying that to downput his ability here. I think this deck is very clearly shaping up to be the most powerful deck in Lorcana. It really does have the ability to win almost any matchup. Does frenemy, Flynn really cause problems? Absolutely. It causes a ton of headaches. It forces you to like really almost always take 4 lore, if not more. If your opponent does have on the play frenemy into Sisu, you're in a world of trouble. But that's about it. In all honesty, that's really the only line that can really punish you. Aside from that, a lot of decks are having a tough time getting over the hump. Emerald Steel, even when they're able to strip you down to nothing, you're still so very good off the top as long as you know, hey, they're going to get rid of my cards. Bucky is going to be annoying, but if I go one jump ahead and I hit my how far I go, and all of a sudden I'm already on 6 or 7 resources before I'm out of cards, then I think it's okay. I think understanding that cards like Ice Block are only mediocre in that matchup, so you're not really like mulligan for them, knowing that you don't always need an early popsicle. Like, yes, it does help. It gets you out of those things, but it's not like a requirement. The real focus of that matchup is going, I need to mulligan for my ramp. I need to get as many resources as possible so I can play off the top of my deck as best as I can. I think once that happens, you understand that you're just way better off the top than your opponent because you end up having, what do we have? We have 3 CISO, 3 B prepared. That's 6 board wipes against a deck that has no recovery. The Emerald Steel decks, in most cases, fold to a B prepared or to a Sisu. Really, a Sisu. If you hit Sisu against them and now you have a 3 lore character that you can work with as well, you really do punish them. So because of that, this deck has really just showcased like, hey, I'm a powerhouse in the metagame. Everyone should be threatened by me. Again, this was the most successful deck in top 64. It was a higher percentage deck in top 16. It found its way into a top 4. It did all of these things really incredibly successful, and it's a deck that moving forward should be at the top of your radar. Going into a tournament, you need to respect this list. You need to respect this deck. Definitely need to understand how to play against it. And what I think is most important is that you need to understand when this deck misses a beat and how to capitalize on those things. All in all, this deck is phenomenal. The deck looks great. It plays well. The biggest standout is the Great Stone Dragon, which I think is a card that you might see more and more. There was actually quite a bit of these in the top 64 in deck list. It's a card that we're going to be talking about at length in another video coming up on the channel. So if you want to hear more about this card specifically, definitely hit like, hit subscribe on the video so you can hear more cards like Great Stone Dragon that people were playing that you might have missed and not picked up on. And we're going to be discussing why they were playing those cards. Congratulations again to Tomas on top 4 finish. Huge success in a tournament of this stature. Emerald Amethyst was the runner-up played by Jordan Moore in Chicago. What I can say for certain is that this is a deck that was definitely not expected to do well. Going into the tournament, I don't think I talked to a single player that was like, yeah, Emerald Amethyst is the deck to watch. Emerald Amethyst is the deck to beat. So that really can work in the favor of players that feel very comfortable playing a deck like that. Knowing that you're going into a matchup that your opponent doesn't have a plan for is huge. So when you can find these decks like this that really take advantage of your opponent not understanding how to play against you or its successful lines, it could set you up for huge success if you are the one that's well planned. Jordan Moore certainly had those things in mind. In the Into the Inklands metagame, we were dependent on Ursula Deceiver of all being able to exert and sing 2 friends on the other side to draw 8 cards, or sing cards like Mother's Knows Best to bounce opposing characters off the board. Now we are a Diablo deck. Not only are we a Diablo deck, we're the Diablo deck that doesn't even play Diablo 1 cost. By not playing Ursula, you do open up some slots at your 3 cost to be a little more techy. Having characters like Kit Cloud Kicker, Jock, and Diablo, of course. Obviously, Diablo is the most powerful of this. It's one of the most powerful cards in Ursula's Return. It has the ability to continuously draw you cards, all these crazy things. But what I think Jock and Kit do are very interesting. Kit has the ability to kind of time walk your opponent, put them back a turn, push them back, make cards like their Diablo a little bit worse, punish opposing Ursulas, and honestly, so many more other things that I don't think the card gets enough credit for. But, Jock is a really interesting addition. Jock, the concierge of climbing, the 3-cost inkable, 1 strength, 4 willpower, 2 lore, with the ability Sneaky Idea. When you play this character, chosen opposing character gains Reckless during their next turn. Is an effective 2 lore character with a good willpower to stick around. It's not as easy for your opponents to always have answers. There are less Madam M Foxes running around, which makes it even more problematic. And if there's ever a world that your opponent is brawling your Jock, you probably want to give them a thumbs up like George and say, thank you very much for making all my other cards more reliable. So I think that it's a really cool addition to this particular list. Still being a Curse Merfolk Flynn Rider deck is great. Having the ability to win games late with Merlin Goat. The addition of Pegasus is wonderful. It really creates a world where you can almost freely swing with Merfolks and Flynn Riders and the Pegasus you're playing to gain 7 or more lore in a given turn and then be protected by an evasive ward thanks to the shift line of Pegasus. I do think this deck really is just so very powerful. The final edition, of course, is the Ursula Sea Witch Queen, the 7-cost inkable, 4 strength, 7 willpower, 3 lore character with Shift 5, with Now I Am the Ruler. Whenever this character requests, exert chosen character, and you'll listen to me. Other characters can exert to sing songs. This really is a powerhouse in the current metagame. 4 strength, 7 willpower is not things that are easy to remove. Yes, it is banished from Ice Block and Medusa, but 7 willpower is really hefty. It takes normally more than 1 card to remove this. Of course, against blue-red, if you get there, they still have answers in the form of Maleficent Dragon. But other than that, this is a really, really problematic card in the metagame. Stopping opponents from singing makes them have to utilize their resources rather than their characters. So it can definitely cause problems in any deck that's relying on singing songs. I think that this was a wonderful meta call by Jordan. Finding himself in the finals should not be too much of a shock to many once you start playing with this deck. But it was definitely a choice that paid off in a huge, huge way. Being so very close to winning DLC Chicago is not something that should be glossed over. Again, just because this was one of 2 Emerald Amethyst decks in top 64 doesn't mean that it was a fluke. It means that he had a plan and executed it perfectly. Congrats again to you, sir. Now let's talk about the winning list from Chicago, played by Brian the Rat, Emerald Steel Discard. I think we all know that going into this tournament, the key factor was this. Emerald Steel was a deck that people did not want to lose to. So what I think is really amazing is that the proof is in the pudding here. This deck might have a high risk, high reward mentality, but utilizing the mulligan system of Disney Lorcana, playing on that scale was comfortable for Brian. He was totally fine sending 7 back to find these incredibly powerful hands. Diablo 1 into Diablo Floodborn, into Bucky, into an action discard, and into an action to sing to remove an opposing character is a 5-card combo. But when you hit that 5-card combo, on average, you win the game. I mean, just like flat out game over, win the game mentality. So going into those concepts and understanding the mulligan system for Disney Lorcana, players were comfortable saying, I'm going to high roll all day. I'm going to play the deck that does the most powerful things. And if I'm right and if I'm successful, I'm going to win a lot of games of Lorcana. And Brian did that all the way into the finals. I think the key takeaways for this list for anyone looking to pick it up are as followed. Hidden Cove may very well be one of the best kept secrets in the metagame still. I don't think people understand how powerful this card can be and how it can alter matchups on the spot. Being able to protect your Diablo from Brawl is massive. Being able to protect your Beast and Robin Hoods from Medusa, also massive. It really alters the math on so many different matchups that it's so very good. And the crazy thing is that it's inkable. So when your hand is strapped and when you just say, I have to gamble on Cove not mattering, I can still ink this card and move the game forward and progress in a very pressuring manner. I think this deck list is phenomenal, and it really does showcase the power that this list has as a whole. The biggest addition of cards you did not see in previous iterations, I believe, are the Flynn Riders. Flynn Rider 1 being a 1/3 character means you don't flat out lose a character in the mirror match. There isn't a good and effective way to get rid of that character. And if they do have the best starting hand in Lorcana of Bucky into Diablo, into Sing, kill your character, the ironic thing about Flynn Rider Confident Vagabond is that it turns into a Flynn Rider his own biggest fan. And with that, you can actually come in and trade into Diablo immediately, which is not something a lot of decks are capable of doing. Will your biggest fan, live to tell the tale? Probably not. But at least you can get rid of your opponent's Diablo very early on the game and slow them down to a nice state. I think Sudden Chill is a card that people have been on and off of. I think Ursula, Deceiver of All, is a card that a lot of people have been on and off of. I think what this deck did better than most Emerald Steel decks is that it really respected and understood the mirror match better than most. The Cove was so very good. Ursula, Deceiver of All, is remarkably incredible in the mirror match. Biggest Fan is another card that created new lines for the list, which are powerful. But what I will say, and I'm really going to double down on this card, Biggest Fan, it can be the best card in the deck. It could also be the worst card in the deck. I have definitely played games in testing where this card hit play and never gained a single piece of lore in certain matchups, which is a problem in an uninkable manner. Like, yes, it's good to be great in the matchups that you want them to be, but it's hard to be a 0 in the matchups also that you can't really afford to have zeros. So playing 3 of that card is a bit scarce to me, if I'm being completely honest. All in all, I think that this is probably going to be the stock deck moving forward for Emerald Steel. I do think that decisions need to be made in a very good manner. I don't think it's a deck that you can just understand, hey, I'm going to play this deck to its fullest. It's going to be the best 60 cards ever. I'm going to understand everything. I don't think you can do any of those things. I really do think that if you're going to play this list, you need to understand the matchups a little bit better. It's definitely targeted towards specific matchups and being a little more successful within them. And I think that that's a really important thing to note. But, Brian got there. Brian was the guy that said, I don't care that Emerald Steel might be public enemy number 1. It is so good at high rolling that I am comfortable going into a tournament and just winning with it. Congratulations, Brian. An absolutely incredible showing, picking up this win in Chicago. With Chicago finally come to pass, all of us finally starting to see what the metagame was starting to develop into. So much data to be covered from top to bottom. It is really exciting to see that we are now just a few weeks away from set championships again. This channel is going to be hyper focused on giving players the best ability to be successful within set champs and moving forward in DLCs. We actually have a ton of plans on how to make you better. I cannot wait to really start showcasing them and announcing them very soon. I have a whole plan for the end of the month. It's going to be really, really fun. If you're interested in getting better at set champs and you want to win a set championship, you need to hit like and subscribe on this channel. I promise you this will be one of the best resources for that. Thank you guys so much for watching today. If you came up to me in Chicago, you gave me the fist bump, you gave me the high five, the shake of hand, the hug, any of it, I appreciate you so much. We had an absolute blast The 2 DLCs so far have been magical. I can't wait to get to Texas, but it has been a rush, and it's nice to have a little bit of leeway in between those tournaments, breathe, catch up, get that energy built back up so we can go and compete in these other and grander tournaments. Congratulations to all of the top competitors that were discussed on this list. One more time, you guys played remarkable. And honestly, any one of you could have probably picked up the W on that day. Thank you guys so much for watching today. We will catch you in the next one.